everybody. Everyone in the recording, thank you for being here. About 3 years ago, we had a presentation by Phil Ansel. At the time, he was the Los Angeles Director of Homeless Coordinator. Is that the best way to say it?
Director of the Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative.
Yeah, initiative. And it was a very enlightening presentation. We got a good sense of why we had a homeless situation. And I felt, after that meeting, I felt like I knew where to go. With COVID, I kind of got lost. What's happening with the homeless? What's happening now? And I thought it was very important to we revisit it, because this is a crucial issue, in all of our hearts. What is happening with the homeless? What can we do about it? So Phil Ansel graciously is here again to present the status of homelessness in Los Angeles County and what we can do about it. So thank you.
Did you want to introduce our second speaker too? Okay. Just so people have the big picture.
Okay. Then Mike Foley from Food on Foot is going to, who works directly with the population currently, is going to give us a picture of what they are doing, what programs are available, and what direct actions we can take. So we're looking forward to that good information. So thank you very much.
Are we wanting the mics to be on, or
They're
what are you
on,
thinking?
but if you want me, I can set it up, or you can just talk.
I mean, whatever.
Just to make sure everybody can hear.
Can people hear okay? Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Like that? All right. We can just leave it. So good morning. Ari, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to come back. I am no longer the director of the Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative. I retired a 1.5 years ago. So I just want to offer that as a caveat in terms of sort of what I can share and sort of any limitations that might entail. So I'd like to sort of present you on 3 areas. First, kind of an overview of homelessness in Los Angeles County. Then secondly, I want to talk about the very current environment, the political environment, and specifically about 5 factors which I think are causes for optimism. And then I'll conclude with some brief reflections on the way in which Beth Sher Shalom could potentially contribute to the effort to prevent and combat homelessness in Los Angeles County. So first on the reality, I assume everyone here lives and or works in Los Angeles County, and if so, you know from your daily experience that we have a true homelessness crisis. And because about 3/4 of people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles County are unsheltered, it is a crisis that is extremely visible in terms of people, seeing people living in tents, for example, or directly on the sidewalk without the benefit of a tent, or in vehicles. So it's a very visible crisis, and it's one that evokes individually and collectively a range of very powerful and visceral responses. Almost every powerful human emotion is stimulated by encountering homelessness up close, from compassion to anger to shame to pain to powerlessness. Almost every strong emotion that any of us ever have is brought up by homelessness. And in this extremely politically polarized world of ours, one thing that's unique about homelessness is that no one is for it. There's not one person, regardless of their political perspective, who sees another human being living on this sidewalk and says, I'm glad that's happening. Not one person. And if you think about it, that is really rare. There's almost nothing where there's that level of unanimity of response. Now, of course, people have different views about the causes of homelessness and appropriate strategies to combat homelessness. But on the core issue of homelessness itself, no one is for it. And that species level identification and species level response to homelessness creates a type of common ground that makes it possible for us to have an effective collective response. I'll just say a couple things about the reality of homelessness in Los Angeles County, and then in Q&A we can delve into that in greater detail if you want. So we have about, based on the most recent homeless count that was conducted earlier in this calendar year, there are about 69,000 people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles County on any given night. Over the course of a calendar year, more than twice that number of people experience homelessness in Los Angeles County, because every day there are people who are exiting homelessness and there are people who are becoming homeless. It's tempting to think of the homeless population as a static group, but it is not static. It's extraordinarily dynamic. Most people who become homeless exit homelessness in the course of the year in which they become homeless, though there is a small and important subset of people who are known as chronically homeless, who are homeless for an extended period of time, including many years. The second thing I'd point out is that homelessness is a countywide phenomenon. I mean, there was a time when homelessness was associated with downtown Los Angeles and Skid Row in particular, but today about a quarter, the county is divided into 8 service planning areas. The service planning area that includes downtown is known as SPA, or Service Planning Area 4. That represents about 25% of the countywide homeless population, and about 10% of the countywide homeless population is in Skid Row. So that means that 90% is outside Skid Row, 75% out of the central Los Angeles City area. So it is truly a countywide phenomenon. And then, I guess the other thing I'll point out is I've already mentioned that about 3/4 of the homeless population in the county is unsheltered, which is so that 75% are people who are distributed between living in tents or other makeshift shelters, living directly on the street with no kinds of protection at all from the elements, or living in vehicles. And there are about as many people living in vehicles as there are people living in tents and other makeshift shelters, though that people living in vehicles are less visible. And then finally, I guess I'll make 2 other points. I mean, one is around the incidence of mental illness and substance use disorders among people experiencing homelessness. In the last count, about 25% of people were identified as experiencing a mental illness, serious mental illness, and about 25% a substance use disorder. There's a substantial overlap between them, which means that 1/3 or a little more of the people experiencing homelessness at any moment in time have a severe mental illness and or a substance use disorder. Over the course of a year, it's a lower percentage because people who remain homeless are more likely to have a serious mental illness and or substance use disorder, whereas people who move in and out of homelessness quickly are less likely to have those conditions. So if you looked at the well over 100,000 people in LA County who experience homelessness over the course of a year, it's a lower percentage of that group who experiences severe mental illness and or substance use disorder. And then finally, just sort of a word about kind of the economics of people becoming and remaining homeless, which will be a bridge then into what I want to talk about in terms of causes for optimism in the current social and political environment. That the fundamental cause of our homelessness crisis is there's not enough housing that people can afford to rent. There are over 500,000 renter households in Los Angeles County that are considered severely rent burdened, which means that they spend more than 50% of their total income on rent. More than 50% of their total income on rent. So by definition, someone in that situation is precariously housed, because it means that a job loss, an extended illness, a family emergency, a car breakdown, burial expenses, a relationship breakup, any of those things can be enough to push someone who's spending 50, 60, 70% of their income on rent into homelessness, okay? So in that context of this very, very serious shortage of affordable housing, it means both that there's multiple effects of that, all of which contribute significantly to the homeless crisis. So in terms of people who are already homeless being able to secure housing, it means that there's not enough housing for them to secure. That for every affordable housing unit, there are many people trying to get that unit. And you may have read recently, for example, in the Los Angeles Times, quite a major story on the inability of many people who have a federally funded Section 8 housing voucher, which guarantees to the landlord payment of the rent, or then who are unable to find a rental unit, or a landlord who will take it. Part of that is because of illegal discrimination, but part of it is simply because there's 5 or 10 or 20 eligible applicants seeking each affordable housing unit, which then it's like a game of musical chairs, except instead of one person falling out each round, it's many, many people who are unable to find housing that they can afford. That's for people who are delayed in their ability to exit homelessness, even if they have the ability to pay rent on their own or through a federal or local or state housing subsidy. On the other side of the equation, we have people who are being forced into homelessness because they can't either afford to stay in the housing that they're in because of rent increases, or who for some reason need to move, like a relationship breakup, for example. They have to move into less expensive housing that they can't find. So on both the exiting homelessness side and the entering homelessness side, the radical shortage of affordable housing is the fundamental cause. There are other factors in any individual situation that contributes to a person becoming and remaining homeless, but if we look at it from a macro view, it is that shortage of affordable housing that is the fundamental problem. And in fact, studies nationally have clearly shown that rate variations, for example, in the incidence of substance use disorder do not account for variations in the rate of homelessness. It is really the variations in the rate of homelessness are due to the shortage of affordable housing. In one of the last years where I was the director of the county homeless initiative, 133 people a day in Los Angeles County exited homelessness. The homeless services system helped more than twice as many people as in that year, which I believe was 2019, exit homelessness as in the year before the homeless initiative began in 2015. From about 10,000 people helped by the system to 20,000 people helped by the system, plus the many people who exit homelessness on their own or with governmental help outside the more narrowly defined homeless services system. But in that same year that 133 people a day exited homelessness, 150 people a day became homeless. So every day, 17 more people were homeless. So 17 times 365, that was the increase in that year. So the biggest problem in effectively confronting homelessness in Los Angeles County is that inflow. Because the system is doing a reasonably good job and a better job than ever before in helping people who are homeless to exit homelessness. But the problem is that inflow. It's like a boat with a hole in the bottom that the people bailing the water out of the boat are bailing out more water than ever before, but nonetheless more water is entering in the bottom of the boat, so the total amount of water in the boat is growing. All right, so that's a very quick sort of set of comments about the reality of homelessness in LA County. Let me now shift to talk about 5 factors that I think are cause for optimism. So I'm going to start at this, talk about 3 factors at the state level, and then I'm going to talk about 2 factors that are specific to the city of Los Angeles. So at the state level, we have 2 things happening that are calculated to increase the supply of affordable housing and enhance the local city and county response to homelessness. So in about 2 years ago, the legislature adopted SB 9, which entitles most homeowners to build a duplex who have a lot that has been zoned R1 for single family zoning to build a duplex instead of one house, and moreover to divide that single family lot into 2 lots, each of which can accommodate a duplex. So that means that effectively a lot, instead of having 1 house, could have up to 4 houses if it's subdivided. So that's very important because single family zoning applies to the vast bulk of residential real estate in urban California, including in Los Angeles County. And single family zoning goes back to the early part of the 20th century and was really a racist response to try to protect enclaves and build enclaves of white homeowners. And there are indigenous forms of housing in Los Angeles County, such as bungalow courts, where you have 4 houses around a courtyard that could be built on a single unit that are compatible with single family neighborhoods that do not represent skyscrapers being built in single family neighborhoods, but nonetheless have the potential to greatly increase the supply of housing. And because there's no land costs for adding units on the same lot, the cost of those units is much less. Not guaranteed to be affordable, but it's nonetheless far cheaper than any other newly built single family housing. And that's just beginning to take hold. I mean, secondly, the governor has become much more assertive in his interactions with cities around land use and their responses to homelessness. So the governor has rejected the land use plans that the housing plans that each city and each county for the unincorporated areas has to develop every so many years, has become aggressive in rejecting plans that are insufficient to actually enable those cities to reach their goals in terms of increasing the supply of affordable housing. There's not a guarantee that that added stance will translate into more affordable housing, but it's a positive move by the governor. And correspondingly, you may have seen that the governor recently rejected all of the plans submitted by cities and counties around the use of new state funding for rental subsidies and services to combat homelessness, which again, I think overall, now in the benefit of being retired, I think it's positive that the governor is asserting himself in that manner. The third thing that's happening at the state level is that the legislature recently adopted a proposal by the governor to create what's called Care Court, which is an effort to get at the relatively narrow population of people who are homeless and mentally ill, suffering from schizophrenia or another psychotic disease. And it is an attempt to sort of thread the needle between individual civil liberties and the fact that people have mental illnesses that may themselves lead them to reject the treatment that they desperately need. So this will be implemented in certain pilot counties by October 1, 2023 and October 1, 2024 in Los Angeles and the various remaining counties in the state. And it's essentially an effort to, it's not ultimately mandatory, but a court will order people in these circumstances to accept treatment, and if they refuse treatment, then that will become a basis for the government to pursue conservatorship. So it tries to get at people who do not pose an imminent threat to their own health and safety or the health and safety of others, which is the current legal standard for a 72-hour involuntary hospital hold under Section 5150 of the Welfare and Institutions Code. but people who are nonetheless gravely disabled and unable to meet their own needs. At the local level, I think there's two very important things that happened in November in the most recent election, which is the passage of Measure ULA and the election of Karen Bass as mayor. The city of Los Angeles is one of 88 cities in the county of Los Angeles, but it is home to 40% of the overall countywide population and 60% of the homeless population. So though it is not the whole picture regarding homelessness, it's 60% of the picture. So what the city of Los Angeles does matters a great deal in terms of efforts to combat homelessness in LA County. So Measure ULA is a really important and significant measure that will generate an estimated $600 million to $1.1 billion annually for affordable housing and rental subsidies and services within the city of Los Angeles on an ongoing basis. And this is through an increased tax on real estate sales that are above $5 million a year. So whether it's commercial, industrial, or very expensive residential property, this increased tax, as I mentioned, will indefinitely generate, under current dollars, estimated to be $600 million to $1.1 billion annually. And to put that in context, Proposition Triple H, which was adopted in November of 2016 by LA City voters, generated a total of $1.2 billion. A total of $1.2 billion, projected to be used over 10 years to generate 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing. By comparison to that one-time $1.2 billion, this is an annual $600 million to $1.1 billion. So that is a very significant measure, and it couldn't be in the hands of anyone better than Karen Bass, the newly elected mayor of the city of Los Angeles. I started working with Karen in 1996 when I was coordinating Los Angeles County's response to federal welfare reform. And Karen was one of the three co-chairs of the Los Angeles County Welfare Reform Coalition, which brought together advocates and service providers. And she was at the time the chair of the Community Coalition, which she had founded in South Los Angeles. And she is ideally suited for the role of mayor of Los Angeles, particularly as it relates to combating homelessness, because she brings a combination of deep knowledge of the multiple levels of government, which all have to work together to effectively combat homelessness, with a sort of a passion clearly for the issue and for social justice, and a personal style that tends to bring people together rather than polarize them. So for all of these reasons, I think that there is a set of opportunities in the current moment to make progress in combating homelessness, but the sort of deep progress that would actually lead the reality on the street to shift is not something that will happen in a year or two or three, because that depends most fundamentally on expansion in the supply of affordable housing. And that is not going to cannot happen overnight, despite this influx in funding. So then finally, and very briefly, just a couple reflections on what the Temple could do. I know the Temple is exploring joining the West Side Coalition, which brings together faith-based organizations throughout the West Side who are committed to working on homelessness and other issues involving poverty. So I just want to endorse that move. I had recommended that to Ari, and I think that would be a good way for the Temple to be engaged on an ongoing basis. Secondly, my former colleagues at the Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative are conducting a survey of faith organizations regarding their current activity and interest around homelessness. And there is a nonprofit called Communities in Motion that is conducting that survey, and I would recommend that Betsy Shalom complete the survey, and that would also create an opportunity to engage with the consultant, which might provide help in sort of thinking about how the Temple, with its interests and resources, human and otherwise, may want to engage around this issue. And then finally, the Board of Supervisors recently passed a motion directing the county's chief executive office to conduct a series of focus groups with faith organizations to explore their thoughts about how they could work on and collaborate with the county in addressing both homelessness and the needs of other disadvantaged populations. And if Beth Shalom were interested, I could arrange for a representative of the temple to participate in one of those focus groups. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Mike, and then maybe Mike can speak, and then we can open up for any questions or comments that anyone would like to raise.
Well, thank you so much. But before I get started, I just wanted to thank the congregation for having me. I thought to myself, are you having trouble hearing me? I thought to myself, the former head of all things homelessness and me. And I just wanted to share with you again, just how much and important you were and how you're missed. The first, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I attended my first all-day homeless leadership meeting with young staff and managers and all of the LASA folks, and all the people were there, and Phil was one of the leaders. And I noticed, it was really important noticing that frequently what you'll see in these meetings, and many of you have seen this, the executives will go off and have lunch together, and they'll kind of gather over in the corner, and all the people will meet with the people they know. Phil went and sat at a table with his lunch, and there must have been 10 seats. Within 5 minutes, the 10 youngest staff people in the room were sitting with Phil. And there was this engagement that was just amazing. I just wanted to share again, you are an amazing leader, and you're missed every single day in our system. And just a quick bit about me. I had the opportunity, I've served as the executive director of the Hollywood YMCA for a short period of time. I also had the opportunity to launch an organization called Homemade Los Angeles, which is an attempt by the building industry to provide free and at-cost resources to build shelters and repair shelters. And for the last 4 years after that, I was able to put together a new foundation of shelter care and services in the Santa Clarita Valley. And I had the opportunity as well to serve as the head of the Service Project Area 2 Steering Committee. So I developed some understanding of that. But at the core of what over these last 35 years of involvement that I've had is when you look at 69,000 people experiencing homelessness, it's not likely that we can actually have enough money and enough professional staff who are going to be able to solve that problem. It's crucial that we have a groundswell of community behind them and underneath them, and a groundswell of community directly involved in the care and support of people experiencing homelessness. And that's what very much attracted me to coming to serve as the executive director of Food on Foot. And thank you to the congregation who've supported us over the years. Food on Foot began 25 years ago when the founder of the organization began serving chicken dinners out of the back of his car in Venice. And a short time later, moved that service to Hollywood. And every single Sunday, for over 1,350 weeks, without missing one single Sunday, there has been the service of chicken dinners for the folks who are coming through. That has grown over time so that last year there were 819 volunteers who came and participated in that process. That now involves clothing, it now involves groceries, it now involves a great deal. But most importantly, for the last many years, there's been a novel and small attempt to help people go from the streets to jobs to housing in a very unique way. And the unique way that that happens is people who are living on the streets come and volunteer their time, and they wear a green shirt, they wear a yellow shirt, and they get training every Sunday and some during the week with resource coaches. In the parlance, that's called case managers. We don't believe people are cases to be managed. So we try to come up with language that really works for people. And folks come and they participate in that jobs and housing program, get that training, and then when they get a job, once they have a month of that job under their belt, our donors then provide them with free rent for up to 4 months until they can save $5,000 and have an undergirding and a foundation beneath them. So if something goes wrong, that they're set up to continue to be successful. And then we bring them back as alumni to reach back. And over the course of time, that's been a 10-member, 20-member a year event. And it became very clear to our board that this is 87% of those folks over time have maintained their housing. And this is actually a model that could be scaled and could be scaled significantly. So for the last year, we've been building that infrastructure so that today the cohort of those folks in the Jobs and Housing Program is 25 people. Of those at this moment, 20 of them have jobs. And in the last 3 months, 8 have gone from homelessness to housing, and we project that next year, 50 will go from homelessness to housing in that program. So we think that's very much a scalable effort, focusing on a group of people who are employable, right? Who frequently fall through the cracks of systems that are focused rightly on people with the most severe mental illness and the most severe problems that we face. And so that's really the core, and what makes that then sustainable is not going out and constantly seeking more and more and more infrastructure, but building a huge core of volunteers that are doing those trainings, that are doing those workshops, that are coming and mentoring people one-on-one and building them forward. So that's what we're trying to do at Food on Foot. And I wanted to just plant a few ideas for you around volunteerism as you're looking at what you want to become involved in. Joining the West Side Coalition, please, that's just such an important thing for you to do. There's so much important work going on here. And again, our project is in Hollywood, but one day we can see scaling a unit of what we do here on the West Side and in the Valley and other places. So just a few ideas about how folks can be helpful. 69,000 people. How many did you say are actually living on the street?
About 3/4 of that. In the last, in the last homeless count, the estimate is that of 69,000 total, about 49,000 were unsheltered.
Yes, so 49,000 people technically need outreach services. They need somebody to come out on the street and work with them and help them get the services that they need. So that's a lot of outreach workers. That's a lot of professionals. And right now, there is more outreach going on in Los Angeles County than has ever gone on before. There are more people being housed than have ever been housed before. There are services that weren't available 10 years from now. But if you just look at outreach, what's happening right now with outreach is, in order for somebody to get outreach on the street, 90% of it is coming from a call from somebody in the community telling them that there's a problem and there's somebody to go be taken care of. Not that there's tons of people out on the street building relationships with people over time and then helping them access those services. Imagine if we have tons and tons of people doing that work. And I'm going to give you an example of that. Everyday people doing that work. In 1992, I was a manager at a project called the Storefront Shelter for Homeless Youth in San Diego. And the target population was runaway youth on the streets of downtown San Diego and juvenile prostitutes in Balboa Park. That was the focus, and we had money for one street outreach worker. 5 nights a week, 6 volunteers and that outreach worker were out on the street. And there was one person who was remarkably successful. She was 73 years old. She had flaming red hair and the type of grandmother that doesn't have a filter. You know what I'm talking about? Like, many of you know that person, right? She didn't have a filter. And so she would go out and she would start talking without a filter to kids who started calling her grandma. And she could do something, grab them by the scruff of the neck with a certain voice, with a certain way of talking like your grandmother would, and she got more of those kids into shelter than anybody else got into shelter, and they looked forward to seeing her every day. In a county of 12.5 million people, there are some folks out there just like her who could do that work. There are young people, there are students, there are people who can do that work. How can we begin to build that infrastructure? Consider that for a moment. So the other thing is that the creation of shelter beds. So I'm just sorry. There's 10 more things that for us to be successful almost have to happen in a very rapid and growth rate manner that have to happen at the same time. Shelter beds, outreach, permanent housing, job development and basic services, law enforcement, mental health treatment, drug and alcohol treatment, rapid rehousing, homeless prevention, easy, quick, and affordable health care and street medicine and transportation services. Those things really need to be working in concert, right, and building over time. And I'm not going to go over every one of these, but I don't think there was a proposal by one of the candidates for mayor that was not Karen Bass, who suggested that we could build 30,000 shelter beds in a very, very short period of time. So let's think about that for a minute, because that's not wrong. That would be amazing if we could do that. But I want you to think, so not counting shelter construction, management, accounting, transportation, mental health, and drug alcohol support, activities and insurance, just staffing and food would cost $647 million a year. And hundreds of staff who are trained to help people experiencing homelessness. This type of thing is necessary, but imagine it's going to take a volunteer groundswell and foundation underneath that to actually get us to the point where we're able to be successful. How can we begin to do that? So permanent supportive housing Phil just gave you the entire picture of permanent supportive housing, where it costs sometimes up to $800,000 to build one unit of permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. And there are other ways to build those at less expensive ways. And one of the things we run up against is neighborhoods who don't necessarily want that to be in their neighborhood, or places where there's empty space that we could build those things for less cost than that. But we run into not in my backyard. But a study was done in the exit interviews from the recent mayoral race, where 70% of the people said, I'd be willing to consider that in my backyard. I'd be willing to do that. But what happens is when it gets started, the 10% are so very, very loud and very, very vociferous that the 70% aren't voicing. From your advocacy, from your volunteerism around advocacy, how can you as a congregation make a real change and really bring that to the fore about how important it is to make that change? I believe that congregations can do that. And another story as it relates to permanent housing is I want you to imagine me looking much better than I do now at age 19. And I had my first job in social services in Flint Springs, California, which is about 15 miles outside of the edge of San Diego, headed towards Julian. And I worked at two weekend days and 3 overnights as a residential aide at a boarding care home for severely mentally ill adults. And social services were so high quality at that time that I was the only staff person with 28 people who were mentally ill at age 19, cooking and passing out medications and taking care of people. And I will never forget, it's driven much of what I've done since. A young man about 26 or 27, severely mentally ill, always working towards recovery. And over a week, he began to spiral downward. And he began to hallucinate and see his drapes on fire. And we had to send him off to the hospital. He's a very sweet musician, very, very ill. So he got some new medications and he began getting back in recovery, and 2 weeks later he came back. And one day he took his guitar and took the bus to the park and was playing guitar on a park bench, and another youth with a guitar came over and started playing with him. And they really hit it off, and they were playing very, very similarly, and they were really bonding. And he said, I'm a part of a church music group. I'd like you to come and play with us and just kind of sit in with us. He said, you know, I've got a lot of issues and I live at a mental health center. He said, don't worry, I will come and get you. So they came and got him, and they brought him, and he was playing guitar with them. And after about a week or two, he was playing and he's playing, and then he was going 2 or 3 times a week with different people from the congregation coming and taking him. And they asked him to join the band. And he said, I don't know that I can do that. You're going to count on me. And they said, why don't we just consider that when you've got times of difficulty, you just need some downtime. And then you come back and play. 3 or 4 months later, one of the congregants had a guest house and brought him to live at the guest house. And he got a family and a congregation, and he got permanent housing, and he had the support that he needed, and he was remarkably successful after that. There are 2,000 faith congregations in Los Angeles County. Imagine if everyone in the course of the year found a way to help 5 people. Similarly to what I just described, 5. In a course of 3 years, you could help 30,000 people. So begin to think, as you think about what a congregation can do, something very small, when it's done in a large way, can really build things up. And there's the most perfect ground for that, the fertile ground for that is the area of homelessness. Then, let me just go back again. Remember I talked about those shelter beds, $647 million? Those are with staff who are paid somewhere between $20 and $27 an hour, which means that if they lose their jobs, they are often potentially becoming homeless themselves, right? So we got to think about that as well as we then look at volunteerism, because if you just look at job development and basic services, that requires resume building, job search, job connections, SSI, SSDI, general relief, medical paperwork, securing identification and paperwork, housing searches, searching for housing and then helping them connect to that housing, how to ride the bus. It's hours and hours and hours of professionals sitting down with people, one paperwork at a time, making that happen. Imagine what would happen if there was a groundswell of volunteers who are willing to be trained in little parts of that and sit with people one-on-one and mentoring them through those processes. What the professionals then could be focused on is actually building the relationships and the trust that people need to move forward. And I didn't want to leave out two last things, and then I'll end. Law enforcement. Humane and consistent law enforcement is incredibly important. When I look out my balcony, across the street from me is the city council member's office, the police station, and a tiny home village with 100 people living in it. For a year, not a single problem. The most well-run homeless program I've ever seen from across the balcony. And then folks decided, well, we needed to have an ordinance, that there was a sit-lie ordinance, that if homeless people were sitting or lying in the neighborhood, that they couldn't do that. So there's signs up around the neighborhood. And all of a sudden, in a little parking space that's not connected to the shelter, a tent popped up. And then another tent popped up. Right? And then there was issues and there was problems. And the police did not enforce that. They didn't enforce that. And now think, when I go to Hollywood, and you can see this if you go to Hollywood, you go through the Cahuenga underpass, we see this with people coming to our program every week. 350 people will come and get food from us every single week. There was tent after tent after tent after tent around the Judge Carter time. Probably 25 tents. And then they were all cleared out 3 months ago. Today, there's tent after tent after tent after tent back. In our serving, we'll see a 20% decline in people, and then a 20% decline in people coming back, and a 20% decline in people, and a 20% decline coming back. There is a place for people to care in a loving and humane way about making sure that the support that people need is there, but also that the accountability is there as well. So I don't ever want to leave out the importance of high quality law enforcement. And the last thing I wanted to leave you with, again, is we often think that regular folks can't really help people who are drug addicted and have issues with mental health. And I just want to share with you that that's not necessarily true when it's connected to professionalism. Another city that I was in, we tried to build the very first, I used that same street outreach model that I started with when I worked at the storefront shelter. There was no street outreach services in the city. And there was a group of people experiencing homelessness in a park. And I felt that if we could really focus on that group, as well as doing all the stuff that we were doing, we could have an impact and we could show in a short time that we could help people. And there was this one guy who was in particular very, very difficult and very much a ringleader of everything that was going on around it. And so that group of 2 case managers and 6 volunteers focused a lot of attention on that group. And they focused week after week attention on him. And one day, they found him face down in the park, very, very close to death, having overdosed on alcohol. They rolled him over, called an ambulance, and they had heard that he'd been suicidal during that day. They followed him to the hospital and refused to leave, and stayed with him until he was conscious. And they said over and over again, he's suicidal, he's suicidal, he's suicidal, he's suicidal. And the first time ever, he was admitted to the hospital for mental health treatment. And he got mental health treatment. And then we found a way to, there were no openings in the detox, there were no openings, there's no openings for all the things that were alcohol related. And we saved enough money to get him into a sober living program until he could get into a 1-year program. That was 11 years ago. Every year that city, in the weekly newspaper, they list at Thanksgiving time the local heroes, like 50 local heroes in the city. He was one of those heroes because he went and got a drug and alcohol certificate and became an outreach worker himself. It's the everyday we're present. People with drug and alcohol issues will bottom frequently and no one's there. It's getting lots and lots of people involved. So I just wanted to plant those seeds that to really get where we need to go, it's going to take a groundswell of people. And you may not think it's somebody like you, and it may not be. But then again, it might be. So think about it.
So let's open up for whatever questions or comments anyone would like to raise. Please.
First of all, I want to thank you both so much. I'm choked up about the whole thing. I'm fascinated with all of your details because we're new to LA, but we have the same problems in the DC area where we come from. Where do you have some resources that you can send me to that I can memorize? I wrote pages and pages and pages of your details, but I'd like some books to read about this or some articles to read that I could have in my hands that I can sit there and say, these people can come in and they exit the program. These people, that kind of thing.
Well, I think if you go to the website of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, lahsa.org, and look for the 2022 homeless count, then the data that I was citing is principally available there.
Could you say those letters again?
lahsa.org.
And what those letters stand for?
Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which is a joint powers authority created by the city and the county of Los Angeles that plays a central role. I mean, we're a very complex governance system in LA County, but it's the continuum of care that's required to exist by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And one of the name is LAHSA, LAHSA. One of LAHSA's functions is to conduct the homeless count. And the statistics I was citing were principally from the 2022 homeless count.
Okay, I have the letters right now. What comes after LASFJ?
lahsa.org.
Got it. Thank you.
Linda, you will share that with everybody, correct?
Okay,
I
let's
will.
You'll do the
go over
research.
here and
I
then
don't
go
have
further.
to.
Yes, please.
We're gonna use the microphones as we go for questions.
There we go.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, questions but not answers.
You're loud enough.
Okay, I've heard that.
Is this on?
If you could repeat the question.
Is it not on? Did you turn? Well, this one is. Maybe it died.
Hi, thank you again for both of you coming. I wrote a bunch of things, and as I was writing, some of you touched on many of my points. I was concerned, especially during the mayor's race, hearing the debates about permanent supportive housing and how long that takes, even though that's an evidence-based model. And I wanted to get your thoughts on quicker ways, especially, winter's coming up, getting people housed quickly into shelters, transitional housing, And also, if you could speak to, I believe, the growing population of women and elderly that are homeless. And also, you know, like at the VA campus, they have those little tiny homes, and your thoughts about things like that.
Okay, well, that's a lot of different questions. Let me try to just quickly address the different points you raised. Neither of us talk that much about shelters, so let me just pull back and say a word about that. When you see people on the street, the obvious thought is, well, why not move them into shelter, some kind of indoor accommodation? As Mike mentioned, the cost of shelter is more than the cost of housing. It costs more to maintain someone in a shelter bed than it does to pay rent for them for an apartment, if you can find the apartment. So I'm setting aside capital costs, just the operating costs. And of course, someone in shelter is still housed, so is still considered homeless. So the analogy that I think helps drive this home is, imagine a hospital where all the emergency room beds were filled. And you have people coming in an ambulance, nowhere for them to go in the emergency room. And the reason the emergency room beds are filled is because there aren't enough other hospital beds for them to move into. Well, one solution would be to add emergency room beds, but obviously in that situation, the better solution is to add regular hospital beds, so people who don't need to be in the emergency room can get out and free up a bed for someone else. So that's the dynamic in our homeless services system, that we actually have enough shelter if we had enough permanent housing for people to move to. If you look at the way a properly functioning homeless services system would be structured in terms of the distribution of resources between interim housing, which is the kind of umbrella term for shelter, and permanent housing, the problem isn't that we don't have enough shelter, it's that we don't have anywhere for people to go. So I just wanted to make that point. I mean, on the issue of the time and cost of building permanent supportive housing, I mean, there's multiple factors there, but on the time, it's principally a combination of the time it takes to braid together multiple funding streams, each of which has their own rules and complexities on the one hand, and on the other, the permitting and regulatory processes that are primarily controlled by cities, because that's a municipal function. The county only exercises that role for the 10% of the countywide population that is in unincorporated areas. The remainder rests with 88 cities, many of which are quite small, have limited resources, and have a lot of neighborhood opposition to siting of affordable housing, and especially the permanent supportive housing. So it's getting at those two issues is the key. I mean, there has been experimentation in Los Angeles County with foregoing the primary federal funding sources for permanent supportive housing construction, which is called the low-income housing tax credit, which on the one hand is essentially free money locally, but on the other hand, it takes a lot of time to access it. So there has been experimentation with that, and the city of Los Angeles, now with this big influx through Measure ULA in funding, which is principally on the construction side, will be looking at alternatives to that federal LIHTC funding for at least some of the projects. I mean, it's not an overnight sort of thing, but it has the potential to lead to construction that can be faster and cheaper than the traditional model. And then on the question of tiny homes, I mean, I think that tiny homes are an interesting innovation. They offer privacy and a sense of safety that people experiencing homelessness may not feel in a more traditional congregate shelter, even though the newly built shelter in Los Angeles County is much better in its design than the traditional more kind of warehouse or dormitory shelters. Nonetheless, it doesn't offer the same level of privacy or sense of security that tiny homes do. I mean, the downside with tiny homes is that they take up a lot of land. So, and land is extraordinarily expensive in Los Angeles County. So, I mean, that's the trade-off, right? So that normally, if you have a piece of land that is permanently available for either interim or permanent housing, it's better to build multi-story as a way to make the most of the land cost, whereas tiny homes are inherently single story. So, I mean, I think that tiny homes have a place. Our experience in LA County is recent, and therefore we don't really have research evidence on the level of success of people moving from tiny homes into permanent housing. And that is always the key question for interim housing. It's to what extent and how quickly can people move from that interim housing to permanent housing, because that's the goal, is permanent housing. Interim housing can make an important contribution on that path, but if people get stuck in interim housing, then as I mentioned, it's more expensive than permanent in interim housing, it's more expensive than permanent housing, and it gets in the way of someone else getting off the street. I might not have touched on all of your points, but okay. I just know that there might be other.
I just to quickly
Mike might want to
add. Like I said, I live immediately across the street from a tiny home village and moved there on purpose because I knew one day I would be building something and NIMBY folks would say, why don't you move across the street from one? And I could say, I did. I actually did it on purpose with my children. And I've not had a problem. And people are moving into housing out of the ones that are run well. And I can tell you the Hope of the Valley Rescue Mission is doing a phenomenal job as it relates to both shelter care and tiny home villages. People Concern is local here on the west side, doing amazing work as well. But a part of the growing discussion is that, as you said, Phil, it's going to still take years to get to where we need to go in permanent housing. And homelessness, as we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, is compounding interest, right? And there's a sense that we've got to get people inside because the trauma of the streets is too much to bear for everybody. That's been a part of that discussion. But the problem is, like I was talking about volunteerism, is how do you spend all that money on interim shelter and permanent at the same time? There's got to be a new paradigm. And the last question you had asked was about women on the streets and people who are over. I always say over the age of 55.
When I say elderly,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, people with psychotic disorders, people with cognitive disorders, which is a little bit different, dementia.
I think that while we may see percentage increases in various populations, that shifts and that changes over time. The answer to always is, who do you see on the streets? Is everyone? And what are their problems? The answer is simply yes. Yes to this, yes to this, yes to this. All of those things you see on the street. If you come out to one of our Sunday sermons, you will see every type of person. You'll see children, you'll see families, you'll see elderly, you'll see people of all races and creeds.
If I could just add on for a second on the issue of women and the elderly. So women constitute 32% of people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles County, and it's self-evident that there's a set of vulnerabilities that women on the street face, particularly in terms of the risk of sexual assault, that is greater than that faced by men. And then with respect to seniors, there is a growing population of seniors. There is a group of people who, late baby boomers who became homeless, and out of that generation, if you will, it's been has been passing through the homeless population, not necessarily the same people, but there's this sort of demographic move of older people, and then it's very much compounded by this high rents in LA County, because poor or low income seniors in this country are entitled to supplemental security income, which is about $1,000 a month for about $1,000 a month. So there are many, many places in the country where with that people can afford a single or a room in a house, but not in LA County. And that's why we see increasingly seniors who, despite having an income of $1,000 a month, are homeless because they can't find housing.
And the last thing that I would say to answer your question finally, I don't believe there's been enough focus on shared housing. In Santa Clarita, there was an effort to match seniors it'd have a questionnaire that matched seniors that could then, and this wasn't homeless people, just seniors who could live more easily with one another. The idea of creating congregant living situations that the social work shifts to getting someone housed to keeping them housed with another person, which adds a whole other layer of how we work with people. Shared housing and scattered site housing is going to be essential to succeed moving forward.
I agree.
We're gonna go Diane and then Diane.
I have,
Hold on, there's
Oh,
somebody
sorry.
behind you.
you've got two different.
It's on.
Hi, it's so nice to finally get somebody who knows about the homeless. What I've been trying to find out, how can we find out where all the money we've spent on people? I keep trying to, we're certainly excellent in collecting the money, but how can we find out how it's spent? There's nowhere, I've been trying to find in the county the budget to see the total amount collected for the homeless and the total amount used. Is
Right,
there
so-
a place spent?
Yeah, so there's more than one funding stream. So for the
there's what?
two, there's more than one funding stream that supports services for people experiencing homelessness. The two principal locally generated funding streams are Proposition Triple H in the city of Los Angeles and Measure H in Los Angeles County, which is a 1/4 cent countywide sales tax. And that was what I was directly responsible for. So with respect to Proposition Triple H on the mayor's website, the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, there is a Triple H website that is very detailed about the projects funded, how much Triple H dollars went into each, and the status of whether they're open or they're in construction. And then on the Measure H side, the county homeless initiative website, homeless.lacounty.gov, has detailed information on the allocation of the funding by each of the various strategies like outreach, shelter, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, prevention. That's all very transparently displayed on that website. So those are the two locations you can
And
see.
also, the follow-up, how much is the fight between the city and the county over supporting the homeless is made up just for bureaucratic inadequacy? Is it really true that they're fighting with one another over this issue?
So,
Could you repeat the question?
yeah, the question is essentially around to what extent is there actually conflict between the city and county of Los Angeles relative to homelessness? And to what extent is that an excuse that people put forward for inaction? So there's a long history of conflict between the city and the county around homelessness, around who has which responsibilities, and I mean, there's been litigation over multiple decades. When I became the director of Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative at its founding in August of 2015, we were enjoying a moment of historic alignment between the city and the county that was attributable to a very substantial degree to collaboration between Mayor Garcetti and Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, who was leading the county effort. And that collaboration at the level of elected officials created a political context in which, despite the relationship between the city and the county being challenging on an ongoing basis, frankly, the most difficult part of my job as the director of the LA County Homeless Initiative, we were able to really make magic happen between the city and the county and in the countywide homeless service delivery system, because we had that leadership at the top that set the tone for collaboration. There are a series of factors, primarily beginning in 2020, which eroded that collaboration between the city and the county. There was a lawsuit that was assigned to a very irascible judge named David Carter, and his approach really pitted the city and the county against each other. There were the demands of the pandemic, that were extraordinarily challenging for everyone involved. And I would say, frankly, there was Supervisor Lee Thomas, moved from the Board of Supervisors to City Council, and Mayor Garcetti's engagement around homelessness, I would say, diminished to some extent from those earlier years. So all of those factors led to what is, in fact, a worsening of the relationship between the city and the county. One of the things I'm most excited about with respect to Karen Bass becoming mayor is that she is a natural collaborator and she has close pre-existing established relationships with all of the members of the County Board of Supervisors, and it takes that political leadership at the top that sets the tone. So I'm very optimistic, and the lawsuit that I mentioned is resolved on the city side. It has been for some time. There was a negotiated settlement on the county side that the judge has not accepted, but I suspect that final resolution is close. The impact of the pandemic has waned. So I think there's a lot of factors there that should enable there to be a resurgence in collaboration between the city and the county.
I would just add that my experience is that the county has actually been very consistent. The county's been very consistent with what they're doing and what they want to do, and the supervisors themselves have been very, very consistent. But when numbers turn in a negative way, politicians tend to act like politicians. And the city, I would suggest that there's more conflict between people amongst one another in the city than there is in the county right now. And as the director of as the leader of the SPA 2 steering committee, I can tell you in the San Fernando Valley, there are 7 different council districts in the San Fernando Valley. And they're ripe for, I don't want these people in my district. I don't want these people in my district. I want to have this, one council member wanted to have, in the questionnaire, he wanted to add to the questionnaire, where did you graduate from high school? So that they could say, this person graduated from Reseda High, and we're over here in Woodland Hills, and they need to be served over there. So this was a bubbling thing that went away fairly quickly, but that's what happens when the folks who truthfully are held accountable. I mean, we don't do the work, but it's the politicians who are ultimately held accountable. And so I think the county's been very consistent, and I think there's gonna be great change at the city in a very positive direction, and they'll be able to come back together.
Yeah, and if I could add, I agree with everything that Mike said, and that on the dynamic within the city, that the city council is the most problematic part of city government as it relates to homelessness. And I think that having, Mayor-elect Bass, or maybe she was just inaugurated, I'm not sure, she might be Mayor Bass by now, but, or maybe that's tomorrow or the next day. Next week. That I think she will be able to provide the kind of leadership that will help corral the city council. And I think the change, the former city council president, I can say, based on my own personal experience, was not a positive force in terms of creating alignment within the city council. She really fomented the kind of fragmentation and conflict within the city council that Mike was referring to. So I think that change as well will complement the change in the mayor's office to sort of help bring the city more into alignment with itself, which is in turn very important in terms of the city-county relationship.
And while you're handing over the microphone, just an aside, Food on Foot doesn't accept government funding.
What did you say?
Food on Foot doesn't accept government funding.
Diane's the last question, and then you can keep schmoozing.
Okay, boy, that's to the bottom line. My question and comment is directed to Mike. I would like to build on the relationship that we've established over the last few years. And the comment is, I think a lot of, or maybe 90%, of the not in my backyard attitude probably comes from fear. How many of us really know a homeless person? So I was thinking to myself, as you are all throwing numbers, it was an amazing presentation that you both gave. It was just amazing. What can we do? And Mike, you were really hitting on the volunteerism. Now, our social action team has more than an abundance of MSWs and PhDs who are probably not afraid of the homeless. But I'm one of those who's never volunteered to do, even though every year, every committee I've been on, requests help on counting the homeless. But frankly, I'm afraid to go out at night as an elderly senior woman to do that. So I'm wondering if we could start very small, be the pebble that gets thrown into the water, and maybe it will spread, maybe not. If you supply the trainer, we can do a train the trainer and develop and design. Let's say our goal would be adopt one of them, one of these people, and meet some homeless people. And I know that you have a variety of homeless people that you have already gotten out of being homeless and gotten some training and gotten some job and got housing. So it's just a thought. But I think that we could deliver the training. We could probably get volunteers. We don't have to say that our goal is that you're going to adopt a homeless person, but that would be our goal. To break down the fear systematically, but it has to start with meeting someone that you might be afraid of. We could design the program with you.
If you've been to Food on Foot, you see that it starts in a really remarkably safe way. People come, they put on a smock, they look someone in the eye, take off their sunglasses and give them food and hear about everything that's going on. And then you see the people wearing a green shirt or a yellow shirt or a gray shirt that are housed, or the alumni in a blue shirt. You see people who have been successful all in one place trying to help other people. And it becomes an easier thing to join. So about a month and a half ago, we hired our first volunteer director. And now what we're attempting to do is create a program where we attach a volunteer to each of the people that we're helping and help them with their financials and help them with all the things that they need, and then follow them so that when tough decisions come, they're not just calling a professional, they're calling, hopefully, the lady with the red hair, right? So that's what we're gonna try to build. So I think there's a wonderful place for you in that. And once again, I would also look, so for a couple of years, I was sort of shouting off into the vast wasteland around volunteerism, but the San Fernando Rescue Mission just came out and said, we're going to build a volunteer-centric organization from top to bottom. I recently saw that there was a new volunteer effort going on at People Concern. So there's lots of opportunities, and I would be happy, we would love to have you come and be an organization that really builds that. I've got a great person we'll connect you with on that.
Well, that's wonderful. I just wanted to ask if anything has changed that at Food on Foot, because of course COVID interrupted it. We had originally started, when we first began this relationship, by requesting the possibility of our coming and helping serve on a Sunday, on the Sunday meal program. Got interrupted a little bit with COVID, and also we wanted to bring children of a certain age really be accepted. And we were told that in order for us to volunteer to serve and meet people by Food on Foot, that you were only taking large organizations, or you would take an organization, but they had to pay, or we would have to pay a certain amount of money to be able to do that. And that really stopped us right there. Is that still the policy, or have you changed that policy?
Well, we can certainly work with you to find it, but I'll tell you what we found that makes us unique again, because we said we don't accept government funding. What frequently happens is we have people who will volunteer. We'll have a group that'll volunteer and they'll take up 20 spaces and then 5 people come. What we found is that if we ask people to make a donation of $25 and come and volunteer, 100% of them come. And
Each
we're
individual?
Yes, and we're always full, right? We're always full and everybody shows up. So that's why that policy is in place. And then with groups, with large groups, we've asked for them to become a sponsor of the organization. But remember, it's a donation and it's not something that says it has to be that way.
It's not something what?
It's not something that's 100% required. It's something that we ask for that donation. So I'm going to give you my card and we can work together on a project. No problem.
Good deal.
So want to thank everyone.